things tend to go wrong in production, especially for new systems, new applications. And when I have to be tasked to figure out what went wrong, then I start to care very deeply about observability. Designing for observability is not something that's just done. It's part of a process, and that process needs feedback. I need to understand what my developers are spending their time on, understand, well, what things do I need to put in on the observability side to make their lives easier?
Hi, I'm Liz Fong-jones.
And I'm Charity Majors.
And you're listening to Observability Cast, or o11ycast for short, a fortnightly series about the art and science of making production systems observable, easy to maintain, and appropriately reliable.
o11ycast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast.
I try to stick around on my clients until the projects actually go to production, and hopefully after that as well. So I learned about it pretty quickly because things tend to go wrong in production, especially for new systems and new applications. And when I have to be tasked to figure out what went wrong, then I start to care very deeply about observability.
So you don't throw things over the wall. You definitely encourage your teams to practice kind of full cycle ownership of their code.
Is there even a wall anymore? Like, it feels like there never should have been a wall. And we've been busy tearing the wall down. And there are remnants of the wall. But like, is there still a wall out there for most people?
There is. I do get to interact with a pretty wide variety of clients. And when the whole DevOps movement came about, as people got further down the adoption curve, large organizations assumed that meant I need a DevOps department, which is hilarious because...
Yeah, I know. Oh my God.
You just missed the point.
Yes.
So I still see that sometimes, but less and less. So like my current client and team, our operations person is on our team sitting next to us. And so we're working directly with them to figure out what we need to do on the development side to help make their job better and what things they need to make our job better and kind of work hand in hand.
Who's on call?
So it depends on how severe the issue is. But right now it's still there's still tiers of support for my clients. Mm-hmm. But eventually it does come back to a developer. If something is a high enough severity, then we're going to be called to figure out what's going wrong, especially if it's a kind of high critical issue.
Yeah. How has that process been for engineers? Like, I feel like it's so often this lost opportunity because it's pitched to them as like, you've got to eat your vegetables, right? Now you too must suffer, like we in ops have suffered for so long, right? But like, we're engineers. Like, we want to write good code. We want to do things well. And we want to see the fruits of our effort, right? Like, don't we enjoy figuring things out?
Yeah, but not necessarily at 2 a.m. on a Friday or a Sunday. That's not as much fun. And I've definitely been on those kinds of clients and projects. So it does take a little bit of feeling of the pain to understand, what does need to improve in order to not have those 2 a.m. calls.
How many times do you think is reasonable for an engineer to get woken up at 2 a.m. and say, how many times per year?
Well, I would say once is enough before they realize I don't want that to ever happen again.
So obviously this is a leading question. Perhaps I have thoughts and feelings on this topic. I don't know. And there's no right answer. It depends on where you're at in terms of the stability and earliness, blah, 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 all the caveats, sure, right? But I do feel like, the process of putting engineers on call has to be met with an equal commitment from management to giving them enough time to solve the problems so that they're not woken up, right?
The only thing worse than being woken up at 2 a.m. is being woken up at 2 a.m. night after night after night.
Yeah.
And knowing how to fix it, but not being given time away from the product roadmap to do it.
So it usually takes one time for that to happen, for suddenly those kinds of features to get prioritized. Like we need these kinds of operations tools.
Yeah.
But if that doesn't get prioritized properly and given the right amount of budget and time, then you have a staying around problem. People will leave.
Totally. Exactly. And I mean, I feel like it is reasonable to ask an engineer to own a service and get woken up 2 or 3 times a year, right? Like, I think I would ask that of anyone except for people with new babies. Like, people with new babies or people who have serious sleep problems, like, I would totally exempt them from that, right? But I do feel like, it's a serious responsibility and ownership is real. And I feel like that's like a good balance.
So now is a good time for you to introduce yourself.
So yes, I'm Jimmy Bogard, consultant out of Austin, Texas. I've been in software consulting for, 14 years or so now. And before that, worked in product, worked in IT, worked in startup, and consulting I like the best because if I don't like the client, I can just wait 6 months and I have another one.
There are not many of you.
Are there not?
There aren't. No.
I guess not.
There are not many independent consultants, right? Like there are the McKinseys of the world, right? But definitely in terms of people who are paying out their own shingle and getting results, that is a very small set.
Yeah.
Do you find your clients mostly by word of mouth or?
Yeah, for the most part. I do a lot of blogging and speaking and things like that to more or less accidentally have built up some of a personal brand in the .NET world. Mm-hmm. So I don't find it terribly difficult, but I think I'm very fortunate in that case.
Yeah, that's interesting. .NET. So if I was to name a software engineering community that is stereotypically as far away from operations as you can get, that would probably be one of the ones I would come up with. Is that fair or not?
I know. It's especially frustrating as I'm trying to introduce these kinds of concepts into organizations.
Yeah. And
then only to realize okay, I want to introduce this tool. I go to the SDKs and .NET's at the very bottom of the list for just about everything, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to introduce Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Well, the tooling is years behind. Even enterprise Java, which is I consider more enterprisey, but somehow they made it much further along in the observability space. So,
is this just a hangover from Microsoft's reputation, or what? Do you have any theories?
There's a couple things. Most of my clients still have a lot of on-prem deployments, and so they really look towards Microsoft to fill a lot of those gaps for them. Mm-hmm. And Microsoft hasn't filled those gaps, so they just haven't bothered. And when you still run giant monolithic systems, the need for things like distributed tracing just aren't really there. But as they've started to make this move, they realize, okay, the companies have been running, Jaeger for years. We don't have that at all. So we have to kind of build that from the ground up for ourselves.
But I imagine that because .NET is a, virtual machine-based language, there must be reasonably good single-host APM tools that at least provide some kind of a learning path. Has that been your experience? Or what does that learning path look like when people go, okay, I'm moving from monolith to distributed, and what are those analogies that I can kind of grasp for?
Sure. So the story is definitely getting a lot better. About 10 years ago, I was part of a big monolith, it wasn't even called microservice, the term didn't exist at the time, but services, service-oriented architecture. And then, day one of production, when we flipped the switch, something went wrong. We had zero insight into what went wrong.
You're literally trying to craft mind castles in the sky, just trying to reason about where your packet could be and what it could look like.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
And so we wound up having to build a lot of their tools ourselves, having to discover even what distributed tracing needs in order to function, that you need these identifiers and parent identifiers, and you have to have propagation, and you need to identify this request versus that request.
It makes me sad/scared to just think of how many of us reinvented tracing out there in the wild on our own.
And also how many people tried the off-the-shelf things from 5 or 10 years ago and were sorely disappointed because it was too complex.
Yeah, they're just this is not worth it.
Yeah, we have some clients that now that they've moved towards this more distributed model, try the sort of easy mode, which is doing a lot of auto instrumentation, and then finding that that's sorely lacking because some component doesn't have it working for them for whatever reason.
Right.
And now they have to roll a whole bunch of custom vendor-specific code to try to plug those holes.
So I guess that's kind of how you came to the OpenTelemetry community then, is by starting from this position of, what resources are out there for vendor-independent instrumentation.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Because being a consultant, I get to see a lot of different kinds of observability tools in practice, and especially hosting providers. And so you can't just count on a single kind of tool to be in place. And because especially in the .NET world, the SDKs are typically the last ones to be developed. It was usually me having to develop those plugins for whatever next observability tool someone was using in that client. And I was getting tired of developing, I have to develop this Zipkin plugin for RabbitMQ, but that'll go away because the next client's going to use something else. They're going to use App Insights. And it just got really old.
I'm so curious. Have you ever showed up at a client and just been blown away by how awesome their telemetry was?
No, but I'm a consultant though, so I only get called when things are wrong.
I guess you're kind of like a trauma surgeon, right? Like they don't call me for the easy cases.
No, exactly.
But like it's so mystifying to me because, we all crave impact, right? Like we want to like, it's kind of so it's thrilling to like put in a small amount of effort and just like watch like just a mushroom cloud of impact. Like that's awesome. As long as it's not a literal mushroom cloud. You get what I'm saying, And yet like if I try to think about where people can apply effort that reliably pays off just in like orders of magnitude of benefits, it's an instrumentation, it's an observability and like shedding light on things. And just like, I feel like so much of the technical debt, it doesn't just come down to lack of being able to see things, but it starts there and then it grows.
I guess the interesting question that I'd ask though is like, is it because people have been not investing in trying to do telemetry, or is it that their previous investments haven't worked out well, right? Like we've all been in the shop where they log everything using printf debug statements, right? Like where they invest a lot of effort into it, right? Like the kind of full text indexing.
And I think that like I've definitely been at places where we invested a shit ton of effort into like our monitoring tools, and they were useful. They paid off inside the ops team, but not outside of it, because it's almost like so much translation was required to like translate the language of low-level systems, counters and statistics into the stuff that would make sense to software engineers, that they kind of needed us to stand next to them and explain it all the time. And I feel like maybe that's one of the leaps that I feel like we're starting to make, is making tools that are way more powerful available to people, that is kind of, it's in the language that you write in every day, like endpoints and variables, and like it should feel familiar to a software engineer who sits down and looks at it. So maybe that will help.
I definitely see an education gap because people are seeing symptoms but don't understand the disease at all. They don't understand what questions they need to be asking to say, this is the thing that we actually need, to know what tools can help them solve those problems. They see that they're spending sometimes a week trying to diagnose a problem, but don't understand that, well, if they had these specific tools in place, then that would have taken a second to understand or to ask that question, have it answered by a tool for you.
Right.
It's kind of that like lack of imagination, right? Like people can't imagine that there's something that solves it, or right, like they just assume this is the way that it has to be, or like this is for people who are like, way more sophisticated than I am, not realizing that there are actually solutions appropriate to where they are.
I think it's also maybe that we're used to tools where we can craft specific answers. Like how many times do you remember like, okay, I've got this problem, I struggle and I wrestle with it, and days later, I figure it out. Cool, I figured out how to ask this question. So then I create a dashboard so that I always have the answer to that question up, and I leave it there. And this is why our past is like littered with the trail of ancient dashboards. But like the idea of making it so that I can ask this kind of question easily and repeatedly in any circumstance is kind of a level of abstraction above that we aren't used to, maybe.
I don't know about you two, but one of the things I also run into is just the complexities of the budgets of who pays for this tool in companies.
Oh my God. That is so frustrating for us right now. Like, because ops teams hold the budget, but like the people who need to use Honeycomb are people who are writing code and in the trenches with it every day, who are most often, sadly, because in my world this is not the case, but in the median case, those are not ops people, those are software engineers.
So who's going to fit that bill?
So it's kind of like, you have to sell to one while another is paying, and that's not great.
The other situation I've often seen is kind of the centralized omnibus budget for logging vendors, right? Where one team, which is, probably the ops team, just takes on the ownership of their, six-figure Splunk bill or whatever it be, right? Mm-hmm. And then they don't wind up doing chargeback, right? They wind up just having teams just send all of their logs to that kind of fire hosing all of their logs to that one team. And it's not even a vendor bill necessarily. It's people who are growing their own elk clusters, right? And it winds up being, right, like the teams that are sending all of this garbage don't wind up paying the cost for it. And then when those teams instead try to spend money on something better, right, then they're told, why are you spending money, right?
Right.
So how have you found kind of navigating and helping sell that to your clients, Jimmy?
I kind of go the guerrilla route, which is I'm going to get something deployed in a container that is just visible to my dev environment, and like just let's start getting the developers using it as a kind of a local development tool or just for the dev environment. And then we can start to then sell and show the value to say, hey, remember that thing we're trying to fix just in the dev environment, because, trying to get acceptance to something, that took 5 minutes to answer as opposed to, it used to take a week.
Mm-hmm.
So that was X amount of dollars that we saved on that time, and we could now spend it on something more important.
We are so bad at quantifying the cost of our time as engineers. And part of it is because we love what we do, that it's hard to see it as work sometimes. And part of it is just because, I don't know, it's another conversion step. Like, I don't know, like the number of hours that people spend wrestling with this stuff, it far outstrips any vendor bill that they're paying. But it's really hard to see it in those terms. Or like the people who are like, I'm going to staff a team to build an observability tool internally. Like, and it's not just the cost of the team there, but like the opportunity cost, the loss of focus on the business. Like, this is one thing that we are seeing now with the economic downturn is a lot of people who were planning on hiring their own teams to do these things are suddenly now looking at the fact that their headcount is frozen for the next, who knows how long. And I feel like that's actually helping people think more concretely about, okay, my engineering cycles are precious and rare. Should I be spending them on what's core to my business? And is this it? Which is actually maybe a good side effect. I don't know. TBD, I guess.
The other thing that I thought was super interesting about what Jimmy said about kind of starting with the dev environment is that usually, like, if you're using a telemetry provider, right, and sending your telemetry somewhere, for the volumes you encounter in a dev environment, there's actually not that much cost associated with it, right? Like, you can often get that for free. And I think
and the problems aren't that hard.
Yeah, right now we're just strictly using it just as that kind of a distributed debugging tool, knowing that we'll be having to answer more complicated questions in the future. But just trying to clear hurdles for the developers to really focus on adding value as opposed to just spelunking and trying to, go through logs and junk like that.
What does that mean for you, adding value?
I don't know. I used to do a whole bunch of like lean software stuff before I got jaded with the whole agile stuff. And so I would often go through these exercises with customers of doing the whole value stream mapping of, mapping out value add activities versus value detracting and saying, there's value in the answer you have for the customer, but not necessarily the amount of time it takes you to get the answer. The value's in the answer, not in the work.
Interesting.
So how did you first become involved in OpenTelemetry? Kind of what was your introduction to it?
It was, I guess, about 6 to 9 months ago. I was seeing the problem of this current client who was needing distributed tracing. And they did not have a target yet of what tool they wanted to use to achieve that. We saw a tool that they were using today, but it was using auto instrumentation. And even worse, it was using strictly log parsing to kind of infer spans and traces.
Oh, God.
And it's like, I don't want to build on top of vendor-specific headers. I don't want to build on top of this proprietary API. And then that's not portable. I can't take that to the next client, nor if they decide to go something else, that's all wasted work. Just all gets chunked out the door.
Yeah.
So you just start looking, well, what is out there? Just, start Googling open source tracing. And that's why I first got introduced to the, Open Tracing Project and Open Census before that all got merged together.
Mm-hmm.
I got to say, I was a little dubious. It is like littered with the past corpses of projects that have tried to do this and failed, and it's yet another one.
Right, the old XKCD comic about, there are 20 standards, let's introduce one standard to solve all of them. Now there are 21 standards, right? But I think kind of commitment to sunsetting the old things is what really drove kind of adoption.
And that's what we're seeing actually happening in the Microsoft world. They're not quite the new Microsoft. There's still lots of old Microsoft, anti-OSF stuff. But at least with the OpenTelemetry stuff, we're seeing that they're modifying their published APIs to better support OpenTelemetry. And so the folks that are on the OpenTelemetry.net side include someone that actually works at Microsoft. So they're able to go back and make changes to the APIs to ensure that OpenTelemetry works better with it, and that new components can work better with it as well. So that's what really encouraged me is like, it's not something that has no support from Microsoft, because like it or not, in the Microsoft world, our teams expect to get spoon-fed from them.
Yeah.
So it was good to see that there was kind of first-class support from them on this project.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In our world, we develop in Golang, and part of what makes Golang work particularly well for us in distributed tracing is the fact that everything in Golang expects to be passed a context object, right? Like, it's kind of this basic thing that results in it being easier to plumb things through all of your methods, and then you have the data in place to make those distributed calls traced afterwards.
So that is one huge challenge, I think, Microsoft has in their .NET world versus really any of the other platforms being supported is they don't have that easy ability just to wrap or pass things through anything. So Java, you can do bytecode weaving. JavaScript, you can do whatever the hell you want because it's JavaScript. And so they actually need to bake the support in and release it as part of the libraries they publish. And so that's why I was really excited to see them directly support it, because they would have to do that in order for OpenTelemetry to be able to hook into the right places, to be able to publish out the things it needs.
But at a certain point, right, like in their self-interest, right, it's a competitive thing, right? Like if the language that they are promoting heavily does not include support for distributed tracing out of the box, then it will be an inferior language for developing microservices and distributed systems. They kind of have to do this almost.
Yes, I think so. Especially with Azure becoming as big as it is money-wise, and they're seeing, at least me personally, there's a huge gap in their built-in tooling for observability. I mean, they have App Insights, but it's just not the same as other observability tools I've used.
Yeah, definitely. It's a common pattern that kind of cloud provider instrumentation is okay, right? Like if you're running on the cloud, but it's definitely not a substitute for kind of full application dedicated observability that's not coupled specifically to your cloud provider.
I think that's where they got to, because they did that 2 or 3 years ago, where they just tried to bake in their tool to everything. And very quickly they realized that's just not going to work. We can't re-release our entire stack just because our specific observability tool changed an API. Just that can't work.
So you played around with OpenTelemetry, you realized that it solved some problems, and then you started writing about it, which is why, how we first heard of you and invited you onto the show. So kind of, what were the kind of key things you wanted people to learn from your blog post, which we'll also link in the show notes?
Oh, sure. So part of it was just education, just understanding that this project exists and that we should, if you're doing any kind of distributed systems, you need to be keeping an eye on this to understand how it's going to affect you. Another big thing was just understanding how the built-in observability tools inside of Microsoft, how they're changing those tools to be able to better support projects like this. So I work with a pretty wide variety of systems and components in production, and Microsoft only has 2 or 3 of those supporting any kind of tracing out of the box. So if I'm coming somewhere new and I need to extend some library to include support for observability, then I wanted to have some breadcrumbs from other folks to at least learn how I did it, and hopefully how they can help do that in the future.
That makes a lot of sense, right? Because you have to persuade people that, there is a need to add observability hooks into their libraries, or better yet, for them to just add observability into their libraries to begin with. And that requires people to appreciate the value. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. What do you see being the tipping point for people who, if you've seen any converts who have gone from being, dubious to being rabid partisans, or even just being accepting of, yes, this is worth it. You must have seen this journey in a lot of customers now. What are the common themes, or what tends to widen people's eyes and get them on board?
Honestly, the first time someone sees any kind of distributed tracing UI, they're usually just blown away because they've wanted that so long.
Yeah. And
they're probably so tired of just digging through Splunk or something and trying to retrace the steps and figure out what the heck happened.
Because the problem with logs is you have to know what you're looking for before you can find it.
Yeah, they're fine for what their purpose is, but they're not an end all be all.
Yeah.
So that's usually, I show them look, here's XYZ distributed tracing UI. Isn't this great?
Yeah, but if it was that easy, we would all be happily using traces and all this stuff. Why isn't it that easy?
Well, in the .NET world, it's not that easy. That's what OpenTelemetry is really helping to solve. Is
it just friction and tooling? Is that the only reason?
For me, the Microsoft plan, it is.
Yeah.
So in my experience, it's not simply a lack of tooling. So if I, for example, if I wanted to just pick Zipkin itself in the .NET world only might have extensions for 2 of the 3 components I'm using. But if I'm using RabbitMQ, there is no support for that. So now I got to write that. I'm using MongoDB. That doesn't exist. I got to do that. I picked literally any of the other platforms that those tracing tools support. It would be super easy. But it's okay, I have to write code for my clients,
right,
and they have to spend my hours to do so. And are they going to recoup that?
Yeah, exactly. This is kind of the argument that we had was hey, why should we as an industry be employing an army of, hundreds of solutions engineers to write integrations for everything when we could just do it once and be done?
when we started talking to people about tracing, there were two things we heard over and over and over that were problems. Number one, that you had to instrument everything before you even got partial benefit. And that was really like frustrating for a lot of people because like they have to take it on faith that it is going to be that valuable and worth their time. And then number two, that like over and over again, like it would turn into a thing where like, yes, they would have deployed tracing, but one person knows how to use it. And everybody goes to that person when they need to see something traced. And it's never really like become something that is just like part of the average engineer's toolkit, even in places that do have a very extensive, deployment. Have you experienced that, or has it not been that way?
Yes, unfortunately. So I can show them the picture of the trace, and that's great. But there's the second part of it is, okay, let's actually practice how to use it. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll make some API endpoint, just throw an exception, throw an error. It's like, okay, well, let's deep down somewhere. So let's diagnose this and figure out, and kind of give them the shortcuts to understand when something goes wrong. Here's the quick way you can figure out what the heck happens and go back from there.
The thing that I characterize that problem as is it's not just gathering the traces, it's being able to find the right trace, right? Like you can't just have a giant collection of traces that no one ever looks at because no one knows how to find the right trace. You kind of have to incorporate it into people's existing flows around, being able to go all the way from here's the high level graph, here's the error rate. Oh no, the error rate.
It's an education problem, but it points to weaknesses in our tooling. And this is why like Honeycomb from the very beginning was so focused on we don't build for individuals, we build for teams, because we realized that like the act of collaborating with other people, like publishing snippets of your brain and like making your history available to yourself and other people, like even for people who don't think of collaboration as being that important, it is always important because when you're debugging, you're always collaborating with like your past self. And when you're writing instrumentation, you're collaborating with your future self. And if you could make those really solid and really grounded in things, like it helps the entire team, but it also helps you. I don't know about you, but like when I'm working on a part of the system, like I know everything about that, like intensely. But after I've moved on to something else, like it decays, my knowledge decays. When you're working on a large distributed system, like part of it lives in your head. Part of it lives in every other member of your team's head. But each of you is responsible for the whole thing, right? You have to be able to know your part intimately, but then you have to be able to debug and trace it through the whole thing. So I feel like this has been a real gap in products that have been built so far, with the exception of Honeycomb. But like inevitably, like other people have got to start thinking this way about like, wearing grooves in the system as you're using it, so that the way that the expert user debugs and understands and learns, so that knowledge isn't lost and it isn't locked up in our heads, but it's in a centrally available source of truth that we all have equal access to, so that we can democratize it.
And so that if that one expert leaves your team, they don't take all of their knowledge with you. And if people are interested in learning more about this, they should definitely listen to the last episode that we published, or 2 episodes ago, the episode with Jessica Kerr, because that was kind of her central theme, right? Is thematicity, the idea of joint work between multiple humans and multiple systems.
Yeah.
Jessitron, she's great.
She's really wonderful.
She really is.
So one of the things I try to emphasize with my teams here is that designing for observability is not something that's just done. It's part of a process, and that process needs feedback. So I need to understand what my developers are spending their time on to understand, well, what things do I need to put in on the observability side to make their lives easier? But that's not something to just, okay, we've ticked the box, now it's done. Something that still requires feedback to continually improve.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a continuous process, right? Like it's why Charity likes to talk about observability-driven development, the same way we would do testing-driven development, right? Like you kind of have to bake it into a continuous process with that feedback loop.
Yeah, and this goes back to the lean stuff that you were talking about too, because like I feel like, software engineers, they kind of have this system in their heads, like they write the code, they test it, and then once it's tested, their job is done, right? Like test pass, I can merge it and go home. Where like that's just like the pre-test, right? That's just like all right, let's just make sure there are no regressions, no obvious things. But then you're not testing that shit till you're rolling it out in prod. You're not testing it until people are interacting with it. And you're not testing it because so start with the fact that like nobody's staging environment in any way resembles production. It just doesn't, and it never will. And it's better for us to just admit that and accept it and start embracing prod as part of our test loop than to keep chasing this like fucking dragon that doesn't exist. Even if it was possible, no one's going to pay for it, for one thing. And even if they were willing to pay for it, even if we did, and like the gold standard is capture and replay, right? Mm-hmm. I've written this piece of software myself. I know for fucking 3 databases now, capture 24 hours worth of traffic and replay them, with various knobs. Even if you did all that, even if you would pay for it, users are chaos engines. It's like the Michael Jackson death problem. Like it had never happened before. Tomorrow is not today, and it never will be. And the harder we fight that, the more problems we're going to have. We should just embrace it. Like we embrace failure. Happens all the time. It's fine. The point is not to make things not fail. The point is to make it so that users can't tell, that it doesn't impact them, that it's graceful, that it's not fatal, right?
Well, I wish my business could think that too.
Well, I feel like people need to feel safe. If you're asking them to accept this risk and this failure and stuff, you need to help them feel safe and oriented, which starts with putting the fucking glasses on so that you can see where you are, right? Like if you're hurtling down the highway and you're as blind as I am, and you don't have your glasses on, everything's going to be scary, right? And it's not that it doesn't take skill and like effort and focus and prioritization and all these things, but like first you have to be able to see where you're at and get rapid feedback about your actions. And I really feel like people who've grown up with, the last couple decades of technology haven't really adjusted to just how detailed, how specific, how exact, how much visibility they should expect from their systems, how much is reasonable, and like the bar just needs to be raised in people's heads. And they need to realize it's for them too. It's not just for Google and Facebook. and you're not in the Bay Area, which I love. I really like talking to people who are not inside our bubble, right? Like, do you encounter this perception or this kind of sense of preemptive defeat very often out there in the field of just like, yeah, well, we're not Google or Facebook. We don't get nice things. This is as good as we can do. This is as good as we should accept for ourselves.
Yeah, pretty frequently. But I guess that's one advantage to being a consultant is I'm trying to be there to help them solve the problems that they know about, but also kind of find their unspoken needs as well. And things like observability are definitely one of those areas.
Yeah.
I meet teams that say, we've got our quarterly release process, and my stomach turns, but I'm there to help them do better.
You see the DORA report, right, where they've got their year over year, they publish their here are your metrics if you're an elite team or if you're a high performing team. And year over year for the last couple of years, the bottom 50% has actually like lost ground.
Oh no.
Well, the top 50% is accelerating, like they're getting better faster.
Yeah, the good performers are becoming great performers, and then the middle performers are actually regressing back to low performers, and we have to fix that.
Which is because, like, if you're standing still in tech, you're losing ground because chaos is always increasing. Entropy is out to get you. Like, things are getting harder, and if you're just standing still, if you're just doing the same thing as you were doing 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, things are not staying in place. They're getting worse, and it's not your imagination. Like it's a thing that we have to actively fight by actively seeking out better tooling, better strategies. We have to see our tech as like a thing that we cycle through, not we deploy and achieve. We don't achieve high ground and stay there. It's more like we're on an escalator and we're trying to climb faster than it could, go down.
Yeah, we have to definitely invest in reducing complexity and otherwise kind of paying down our technical debt, or else we're never going to be able to keep up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're nearing the end of our hour together. Jimmy, any kind of closing thoughts?
Well, nothing. Thanks you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it was really great to talk to you.
That was a delightful conversation that I enjoyed, and I hope you did too. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us on Twitter at o11ycast.
To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. Hope to see you next time.